welcome to your final episode of August 2024, honeys. Today, our inspiration was kind of my mom, more specifically our shared Kindle account and a book she downloaded onto it for her book club. Called The Secret Life of Sunflowers by Marta Molnar, she heavily encouraged me to read it, catching my interest by telling me that it is in part about the life of one of the most famous artists of all time. And so, of course, I ran to it, devoured it, loved it, and now here we are with a brand new episode on that book, the main characters, so on. The figure we are covering today, honeys, is Johanna Bonger van Gogh. She was married to one of Vincent's younger brothers, Theo, and their child, Vincent Willem, went on to found the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Of course, the last thing we want to do is reduce her to the men in her life. However, she's a major figure in part because of how she championed them. The fact is, honeys, we wouldn't know much about Van Gogh at all. He almost definitely wouldn't have become famous if she had not dedicated her life to making his legacy grand after both his and Theo's deaths. So without any further introduction, the life, the efforts, and the amazing courage and perseverance of Jo Bonger. We'll be divvying her life into about 20-year periods, so starting with the earliest. She was born in October of 1862, the fifth of 7 children, and her family was generally conservative, so she was too. Jo, as she liked to be called, was especially close to her older brother Andries Bonger, who lived 1861 to 1936, and who had particularly strong interests in the arts. And an important note about him, since we mentioned him, Andries moved to Paris in 1879, and as the two continuously corresponded, he became her connection to the Parisian art world long before she ever met Theo. Jo always knew she was a strong, impactful person. A quote from her journal she wrote at age 17 says, "I would think it dreadful to have to say at the end of my life, I've actually lived for nothing. I have achieved nothing great or noble," end quote. By 1882, she had studied English, earning the contemporary equivalent of a bachelor's, before beginning work as a teacher at 2 different girls' schools. First a boarding one in Aalborg, and then a secondary school in Utrecht. In 1885, when she's 22, she meets Theo Van Gogh and is trying to accept this relatively dull life she's chosen for herself as a teacher, according to most of our sources. But hers and Theo's is not your typical love story. After only meeting twice, he's so in love with her, he proposes to Jo, and she's shocked. She's almost annoyed even, just turns him down because she doesn't think they've known each other nearly long enough for that sort of gesture. But he respectfully persists. In the Sunflowers book, that looks like the two exchanging letters, but who knows what it really was in real life. Eventually, though, she gave him enough of a chance that they fell in genuine love. So who exactly is Theo Van Gogh? He lived 1857 through 1891, and at this time, he was a rising Paris-based art dealer. He specialized in Impressionist paintings, which were brand new and often a controversial style because of its severe paradigm breaks with academic realism. It presented a lot of challenges that were tough for many Parisians even to swallow. He worked at and eventually briefly directed Goupil's, which was an important connection point for both spouses with the art world. What exactly is Goupil's? It is a branch of the Galerie Goupil, established in Paris by Adolphe Goupil in 1827 on the Boulevard Montmartre in Paris. Today, it's an international auction house. But again, this work allowed him and Jo to create personal relationships with some of the biggest names of the day, including Degas, Monet, Gauguin, but so on. The thing was, the younger brother was mentally steadier than Vincent, so Theo was his emotional anchor as well as biggest fan. Vincent frequently sent over his own images, often landscapes, to Theo in the hopes that he could sell them through Goupil's. According to the Modern Met, quote, aware of his older brother's struggles, Theo selflessly strived to financially support Vincent, helping him to buy art supplies. "You speak of money which you owe me and which you want to give back to me," he wrote in 1888. "I won't hear of it. The condition I want you to arrive at is that you should not have any worries," end quote. In April 1889, Jo marries Theo in Amsterdam and goes to live with him in Paris, leaving behind her family, friends, life as she knew it. She was not such a fan of the very opulent lifestyles of many of her husband's clients, who were often wealthy French elite. This highbrow-centric world, though, did introduce her to what would become a huge part of her life, the fine arts. In 1890, their son Vincent Willem is born. Unfortunately, however, things had already started to go south for the new family. Vincent, in the late 1880s, was not in the best state. Not too long before this time, he'd been a failed art dealer turned failed minister, and a new artist. He was struggling with alcoholism, in poor health, his love life DOA. No one's entirely sure why he was dismissed from the church, but several reasons have been suspected. Some of these include that he had too different of beliefs, that his belief that faith should be founded in the emotions of the lower classes was not going to fly with the church. Others think he was too generous, so on. What's more, he had already established a reputation for being mentally unstable, for alcohol abuse, and for almost compulsively burning bridges. The mid-1880s saw him turning to art while living with his parents in Nuenen. He starts to improve with the move from France to Antwerp in 1887, but he's still very doubtful of himself, very fearful of his own mental illness. So this establishes a pattern of ups and downs in these late 1880s, and that's why we kind of backed it up even before that. The shift towards colors and light in his paintings at the time may correlate with his improving mood. For example, the tulip fields can be seen as a bridge to and also an indicator of this new joyful direction. However, this brief upswing was not to last. He had been living and working out of Arles, France, and there, in October 1888, had implemented the idea to start an artist colony and recruited Gauguin to this cause. But the two were only roommates in the famous Yellow House for just over 2 months because they got in so many fights. It all came to a head in December of the same year. The two got into a violent discussion on painting about sourcing from self versus nature. Van Gogh allegedly threatens his roomie with a knife and almost immediately goes into the infamous ear incident just before Christmas. And so, fearing he might have another serious incident, Van Gogh voluntarily enters the asylum at nearby Saint-Rémy in May of 1889. And a general shift back towards darker can be reflected again in his subject shifts. This is the year that The Starry Night is produced, and Theo starts to fear the ability to sell these darker works, especially. After the ear thing and exiting the asylum at Saint-Rémy, Theo arranges for Vincent to receive care from a Dr. Paul Gachet in Auvers-sur-Oise, which is north of Paris. It is true, during this time, during one particularly bad episode, he did eat some of his own oil paints and had to be restricted from art supplies for a little while. A small but fascinating bit of context, he was not alone in the struggle for validation, greatness, etc. In Sunflowers, Dries's character bemoans the wasteful purchases of Monet and his pointless, endless garden making. And one of today's sources says, quote, "Despite his acclaim, Monet faced criticism from some peers who deemed his approach overly experimental, lacking conventional painting techniques," end quote. Still, though, Van Gogh achieved some level of recognition in the late 1880s through 1990. His paintings were featured at the Salon des Indépendants in Paris between those years, and also with Les XX in Brussels in 1890. 1890 continues this pattern. He starts the year almost getting into a duel. It starts as a heated discussion with the mentally unstable Belgian painter Henri de Gros, who was basically bad-mouthing Vincent's work and person. The two amp each other up, and the dispute only ends when the painter Paul Signac gets involved, threatening to kill de Gros if he hurt Toulouse-Lautrec, who had stood up to de Gros about Van Gogh. And here's where our timelines come back together again. again. The first meeting between the in-laws, Vincent and Joe, in 1891 goes pleasantly enough. Vincent comes to them in Paris for the visit, and Joe's journals show her surprise to see him with a clear direction in his life and art, looking strong, healthy, and cheerful. But tragedy soon struck. Weeks later, Vincent had shot himself, and Theo only arrived in time to watch his brother die. Vincent was 37 and Theo was 33. This means, honeys, that only 2 years after that first failed proposal, Vincent dies. That's how impactful both of these men were on her. Although Theo tries his best, the loss of his brother completely broke him. Between 1890 and 1891, he wanted to make it his life's mission to preserve and publicize Vincent's work. He managed to organize an exhibition of Vincent's works in their Paris apartment with the help of Vincent's mentee, Émile Bernard. But he also suffered from mental illness. Quote, Theo's health declined. In November, he was admitted to a mental hospital, unquote. And here I'll note, photos from that time frame only show Joe and their son, a point mentioned in Sunflowers because it's a actually known photo of the two of them. Continuing it, quote, in December, he was diagnosed with dementia paralytica, a chronic psychosis, now referred to as neurosyphilis, and in January, he passed away, end quote. Following Theo's death, Joe inherits Vincent's drawings, paintings, and letters, along with the brothers' collections of works by their contemporaries. She also decided she had inherited the mission. So now we're at 1892, and let's recap real quick. Joe is now a widow at 28 with a newborn son, and the task of ensuring her brother-in-law's legacy. But Joe, courageous as she is, decides she's gonna do it, and she's gonna do it her way. And honeys, something really important to remember here is that her character made all this possible. She was just as pragmatic as she was full of aspirations. She had a unique combination of level-headedness and instinct and always did things herself for herself. She had pretty much made up her mind that she was going to move back to the Netherlands, but she started her efforts even before that. She reached out again to painter Émile Bernard with the intentions of organizing a solo exhibition for Vincent and increasing his popularity, although from what we know, this doesn't really pan out. But this physical relocation is a strategic move itself. A friend of Joe's had suggested she relocate to the Dutch village of Bussum, which is 25 kilometers from Amsterdam, to open a boarding house, which was relatively stable work at the time and allowed her to support herself and her son. She was advised by several men to leave the paintings in the current center of the art world, Paris, but instead brought back the hundreds of paintings and sketches, plus collections of letters between Theo and Vincent with her. She did this for two primary reasons. The first was the opportunity to play on nationalism. She was savvy enough to recognize that the Netherlands would want the opportunity to celebrate one of their own, to make the country great by association, and began trying to pair with local institutions like The Hague. Her location in Bussum was also beneficial because it offered a lively cultural scene and the opportunity to strategically decorate her new home with Vincent's pieces. She thinks up new avenues as well. She spends a lot of time poring over the details of these letters between the brothers and finds that they not only give insight to daily life, but also to Vincent's techniques, his explanations of how certain paintings by other artists inspired him. He even writes about his intended audience, average people. It turns out all this reading gave her a side personal benefit of a new connection to Vincent. She was able to resonate with his struggle as a misunderstood outcast to the art world because she was one, because the voice of a woman like Joe was often dismissed solely on the basis of sex at the time, and that made her task that much harder. But as I pretty much just said, she's unfortunately consistently met with rejection, dismissal, comments that she's being too sentimental and is ignorant of highbrow art stuff, so her opinion, unfortunately for a long time here, is invalid to the people running the arts world. Nevertheless, Joe's momentum grows and she starts really making it happen. Part of the way she does that is she uses her existing skills and builds up new ones to help her independently pursue these legacy goals. For example, she begins to teach herself the basics of art criticism and uses her fluency in French, English, and German that she has from her years as a language teacher. In addition to tapping some of the contacts that Theo and Vincent had during their lifetimes, Jo also starts to recruit others. For example, John Veth, who lived 1864 to 1925. She singles him out because he's an outspoken critic of academic art, at that point one and the same as realism. So she thinks he's going to love this new direction. Unfortunately, though, he dismisses the work and Jo's efforts. He claims that he is, quote, repelled by the raw violence of some Van Goghs, end quote. But Jo refuses to give up. She gives him a sample of Vincent's letters to use as context, as supplementary material for the paintings, and this actually works. This success and a handful of others encourages her to keep going. But around October of 1891, she makes a very key decision. She's not going to dilute and distribute Vincent's legacy by selling his artworks far and wide. She's instead going to make them popular and in high demand through lending, through making them visible to the public and thus more widely desired and valuable. Molnar, adopting Jo's perspective in the Sunflowers book, writes, quote, Theo had been wrong to try to sell the paintings as the works of a new artist as bargains. Tastes must grow up to recognize Vincent's genius, end quote. Jo initially works closely with German art dealers / publishers Paul Casserer and his cousin Bruno to organize Berlin-based exhibitions. She additionally organizes sales exhibitions to increase Van Gogh's works' visibility. The exhibitions do exactly what they're meant to. They help capture the attention of potential buyers. And then she makes many strategic and always pricey sales of the artworks to, often, collections accessible to the public across the globe. Through this extremely picky, retaining ownership strategy, she's able to skyrocket demand for his paintings, and soon more than 100 shows across Europe, from Berlin to Copenhagen and further than that, in total, are featuring Vincent's works. So in total, between 1891 and 1925, Jo sells nearly 200 of Vincent's artworks, of course keeping the most impressive for the family estate. For a long time, those collections included 2 of the 5 sunflower paintings. Jo and Vincent Willem had a particularly tough time selling those to the National Gallery in London in 1924. So we've gotten through a good chunk of her ongoing legacy building goal in these years of 1892 to 1902, but what about other major life events of hers? Jo continues to have a pretty eventful life. In August of 1901, she marries Johanna Bonger van Gogh, who lived 1873 to 1912. Born in Amsterdam, Gogh studied art in Bochum and lived in Jo's boarding house for a time. They were engaged for about a year, but seemed really on the fence about marriage until they just randomly one day decided, yeah, let's go for it. He was a Dutch painter who was 10 years younger than her and also a solitary preferring depressive, so their marriage was pretty tough. Jo, ever the savvy businesswoman, had negotiated a prenup with him to make sure that the property they brought into the marriage would remain separate, aka Vincent's paintings inherited from Theo's estate stayed hers, and her son Vincent Willems stayed his. Shortly after they married, she moved with her new husband and son to a nearby house, thereby closing the boarding house business. But she was widowed again in 1912 with Johann's death, and she never remarried after that. And honey's tragedy really never left Jo alone for long. Sometime during this 20-year span, her sister-in-law, Wilhelmina van Gogh, who was a very close friend of hers, was hospitalized for mental illness as well. Jo visited her in the hospital and held Wilhelmina's paintings of Vincent's in trust, selling only a few to pay for her hospitalization. Unfortunately, though, Wilhelmina spent the rest of her life institutionalized. Looking more closely at the years of 1902 to 1916, her Van Gogh work, of course, continues. In 1905, she successfully organizes a major exhibition at Amsterdam's Stedelijk Museum 15 years after her husband's passing. And when I say organized it, I mean she herself arranged everything from the works on show to the venue to the worker payments. This show ends up being a monumental moment for Vincent's career. It features a cross-section of his work and has its own legacy, really. It was at the time and remains to this day the largest ever Van Gogh exhibition with 484 works on display. The show was a huge moment in art history. It cemented Vincent van Gogh's reputation as a great artist, in part because it literally placed his works among other masterpieces. Though some found his style too modern, many loved the works on show, especially The Bedroom and The Starry Night. The latter proved that any press is good press after it became more popular when critics compared the stars in the painting to a certain type of fried dough balls that Dutch people eat on New Year's Eve called oliebollen. To many, this further validated it as uniquely avant-garde. For the next several years, she apparently continues translating the letters between Vince and Theo as per her goals in order to further contextualize and popularize the works. In 1914, several things happen. First, she finishes editing the brothers' letters and publishes them as the first volume of Letters to Theo in Dutch in order to reinforce the idea that the artist is indistinguishable from the artwork. We can only assume, honeys, that she meant well and didn't predict how this might become skewed or eventually used as justification for mental illness stereotypes surrounding artists. Nevertheless, that first volume includes 2/3 total of all the letters, and the book greatly helps increase Van Gogh's popularity as well. Once again, we see that her dedication to playing the long game, to playing smart, is crucial in the growth of Vincent's fame, and his reputation is only ever increased by this strategic lending to various early retrospectives, by providing as much personal connection with the audience as possible, even though he's deceased, so on. Also in 1914, she decides to have Theo's remains disinterred from their spot at the time in a Dutch cemetery and reburied next to Vincent's in Over-Zeeuws. Again, she oversees all the details, quote, down to commissioning matching gravestones, end quote. In 1915, she moves to New York to pursue a new route of fame building and legacy making by ensuring that Vincent becomes known and popular in the US of A. She begins having some success shortly after. She gets his works into a group show at the Met, as well as successfully organizing a solo show at the Montross Gallery on Fifth Avenue. But I would be remiss not to mention she, of course, has her own life and separate pursuits at this time. In fact, she starts to take on a pretty major role in activism, especially. In 1905, before she moves to the U.S., she co-founds the Amsterdam Social Democratic Women's Propaganda Club, which aimed to improve working-class education and women's working conditions. The end of 1915 also marks the start of her last 10 years of life. By this point, Jo is suffering from Parkinson's, and so in 1919, she returns to Europe to live her last years at an apartment in Amsterdam and in a country house in Laren later. At age 63 in September of 1925, she passes. Despite being an amazing woman who accomplished incredible things, it's clear that she wished she would have put a little more energy towards her activism work as well. In fact, Die Proletarische Vrouw obituary read for her in part, quote, she always apologized for not being more active in the socialist movement. She would say that bringing her son up properly was also a good thing to do for society, so that has been my main work, end all quotes. But Jo Bonger van Gogh was a singular woman in that she never, literally never gave up. At the time of her death, she was still translating 526 of Vincent's letters into English. And so we have arrived at the point where we talk legacies. Jo's and Theo's son, Vincent Willem, eventually took over his parents' task to promote the recognition and understanding of both his father's and his uncle's inner worlds and their lives, their connections to the arts. He eventually transferred works that were still in the family to a foundation for more public access. As for Jo Bonger herself, one of her last quotes reads, I am delighted that after years of indifference from the public towards Vincent and his work, to feel that the battle has been won, end quote. She herself has recently gotten increased attention and well-deserved credit. There are multiple novels besides, the one we cited for this episode, Secret Life of Sunflowers. These include Claire Cooperstein's Johanna, a novel of the Van Gogh family, as well as Camilo Sanchez's La Viuda de los Van Gogh, The Widow of the Van Goghs. There have even been some other book adaptations of her story from 2010 on. Not many have received good reviews, so we're not going to name them. But the fact remains that as she once helped Vincent's legacy grow, her own legacy is now growing as more and more arts world figures are recognizing the simple reality that, we know about him because of her, and she should be known because of that. So there you have it, honeys, the story of how a household name became such through the efforts of a woman who ran a household, in part to ensure his name would go down in history. This is our last full-length episode for August, but we will be back with a new business on Tuesday, so be sure to tune in. And in the meantime, stay hydrated and take care of yourselves. This podcast and this episode were created, produced, hosted, and researched, as well as fact-checked by yours truly, Celia Bugno. It was edited by our brand new sound engineer and producer of our intro music, Chris Meinhold. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms, as well as your social medias.